Imagine a world where survival isn't about who's the fastest or the strongest, but who's willing to make the darkest choices. What if the games we play weren't just for fun, but for our very lives? In a time when money and desperation drive us to the edge, some will risk everything: friends, morals, and even their own humanity, just for a shot at escaping with their lives and a fortune. Tonight we explore true stories that will make you question: how far would you go to survive? Welcome to a world where the stakes are higher than you could ever imagine. And the price of failure? Your life. Get ready for deadly games. Real stories of people forced to make impossible decisions, inspired by the most chilling, high-stakes games of survival you've never heard of. In these games, only one rule applies. Only one walks away. But before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll never miss a spine-tingling episode. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like, comment, and share the video. And if you want even more, stay connected with us on our social media platforms for more creepy content. Thank you all for being part of this journey with me. And now let's dive into the darkness together. It all started with a simple ad I came across one night. Survive in the wilderness, outlast the competition, win $100,000. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. I'd signed up for a survival challenge in the remote Alaskan wilderness, drawn by the promise of $100,000 for completing the game. It seemed like a harmless way to break free from the monotony of everyday life, a test of physical and mental toughness. Little did I know I was stepping into a nightmare that would turn out to be something far more twisted and deadly than I ever could have imagined. The flyer had looked professional. The company running the challenge had claimed they were looking for participants who were mentally and physically prepared for the ultimate test. They provided a list of gear, a briefing on survival tactics, and insisted that it would be an experience to transform your life. It seemed like the kind of thing any adventure seeker would jump at, so I signed up without much hesitation. What I didn't know was that this was a game, one that took inspiration directly from Squid Game, where survival wasn't about making it through harsh conditions, but outlasting others. The first day was brutal. The cold, the isolation, and the unfamiliar terrain were all part of the challenge. There were 12 of us in total, a mix of outdoorsy types, former military personnel, and a couple of thrill seekers like me. We set up camp and began working through the basic survival tasks, building shelters, foraging for food, and navigating through the thick forests. But as night fell, I began to notice strange things. The guides, 3 men in their 40s, remained distant, offering only vague instructions. It was almost as if they were more interested in observing us than guiding us. By the third day, things started getting tense. We were all exhausted, and some people were already beginning to crack. Then came the first challenge. We were told to hike to a checkpoint deep in the woods, and the first person to arrive would win a supply drop, extra food and a tarp to help us through the night. But there was a twist. The last person to arrive would be eliminated from the game. As we raced toward the checkpoint, I began to sense that something was wrong. The trail had been deliberately designed to be treacherous, and some of us started falling behind. I pushed myself to the limit, barely making it in time. When I arrived, breathless and drenched in sweat, I saw one of the participants, Marcus, collapsing behind me, unable to make it. It was clear he had failed the challenge, but instead of being congratulated, I was told to wait. The guides made a stand in a circle as they declared that Marcus would be removed from the game. I assumed that meant he'd simply be sent back to the base camp. But then I saw them pull out a rifle. My stomach dropped. They didn't just eliminate people from this game, they killed them. Marcus was shot on the spot, his body falling lifeless to the ground as the rest of us stood in shocked silence. We were no longer in a survival contest. We were in a deadly game where the rules were clear. Only one person would make it out alive. The rest of us were forced to continue on, but I could feel the atmosphere shifting. The guides now openly encouraged us to do whatever it takes to survive. That was when I realized the game was no longer about physical strength or survival skills. It was about who was willing to betray, deceive, and sacrifice to make it to the end. As the days went on, the challenges grew more brutal and morally corrupt. We were told to partner up, and one by one, participants began disappearing under suspicious circumstances. Some accidents happened during the challenges. Others were simply voted off, their fates decided by the remaining contestants, just like in Squid Game, where players had to vote on who would leave the game. But there was one constant. Every elimination was permanent, and no one was safe. By the 7th day, it was just me and 3 others left. We were exhausted, dehydrated, and mentally broken. The final task was a race to the extraction point. Whoever reached it first would win. But when we arrived, I was faced with a shocking twist. We weren't supposed to run to the extraction point at all. The real challenge was to eliminate the others before they reached it. I was told, in no uncertain terms, that only one of us would make it out, and the others would be dealt with. The game had become clear. It wasn't about surviving the wilderness. It was about surviving the game. Just like Squid Game, where participants were forced to make impossible choices, we had to betray, manipulate, and hurt others in order to survive. I made my decision. I voted off my remaining competitors, sabotaged their attempts to reach the extraction point, and by the end of it, I was the last one standing. But winning didn't feel like an accomplishment. I had betrayed my humanity to win. The game was over, but the haunting realization set in. Surviving the wilderness was nothing compared to surviving the game itself. I was at the lowest point in my life when I first heard about the smiley face challenge. I should have known something was off the moment Greg sent me the invitation. He was always the impulsive one, always looking for the next thrill. When he told me about the smiley face challenge, I wasn't sure if he was joking, but I followed anyway. The ad was clear. Survive the challenge, outlast the rest, win the ultimate prize. It seemed like just another adrenaline junkie stunt, maybe a little twisted, but the money involved was enticing. I'd never been one to turn down easy cash, and the chance to bond with my best friend sounded like an adventure. We never imagined it would lead to something that would haunt us forever. The rules were simple. Show up at a designated location, follow the instructions, and win the prize at the end. The catch? We weren't told what the challenges were, just that we had to trust the process. I figured that meant some sort of extreme endurance tests or high-risk stunts, but nothing prepared me for the horrors that followed. We were told to meet at an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city in the dead of night. The place was isolated, covered in layers of dust and graffiti, with a creeping sense of decay. When we arrived, there were about 15 others there, a strange mix of people, each with their own reasons for being there. Some looking desperate, others too eager for the ultimate prize. But it wasn't the group that unsettled me. It was the feeling that we were being watched. There were cameras everywhere, but it wasn't until we were inside the building that the full scope of what we had entered hit me. At first, the challenges seemed innocent enough. We were tasked with things like climbing walls, completing puzzles, and navigating dark hallways. But there was always a catch. After each task, a person was eliminated. Not through a traditional vote or timed competition, but in a chillingly clinical way. If you failed to meet the challenge, you were removed from the game. At first, we assumed they were just escorted out, but after watching the first elimination, I realized this was far worse than I could have imagined. One of the contestants, Jessica, had failed to complete a simple task involving climbing a rope ladder. Instead of letting her leave, like any normal game, she was dragged away by masked men who took her into the back rooms. When they returned, the task was over, and Jessica was no longer part of the group. The guides, men dressed in black suits, their faces hidden behind masks, didn't speak. They simply gestured for us to keep moving. It was clear that there was no mercy in this game. The rules were simple: succeed or die trying. By the time we reached the 4th challenge, the tension had reached its peak. The remaining players were now eyeing each other with suspicion. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia. Greg and I tried to stick together, but even he was starting to act strangely. He was obsessed with winning, and I could see the change in his eyes. He was willing to do anything to make it to the end. It felt like everyone was playing their own game, using any means necessary to survive. Trust had become a luxury, one no one could afford. The next challenge seemed innocent enough, an endurance test in which we had to crawl through an obstacle course while blindfolded. The path was narrow, filled with sharp objects and strange noises that disoriented us as we made our way through. But the real horror came when I heard screams echoing from behind me. Someone had failed, and I could hear them begging for help. But the guides remained silent, not lifting a finger to assist. One by one, people started to drop out, and I soon realized it wasn't just about failing the task. It was about survival. That's when I saw the first smiley face. A faint smiley face had been drawn on the wall near the exit. It wasn't just a random doodle. It was too deliberate, too intentional. Something inside me clicked, and I remembered the news stories. Disappearances, bodies found in strange places, all marked with the same symbol, a smiley face. The game had taken a dark turn, and it wasn't just about completing challenges anymore. It was a game of survival. Like the twisted competitions in Squid Game, this was a contest of morality. The rules weren't clear, but the stakes were simple. Only one of us would make it out alive. By the time we reached the final challenge, the remaining contestants were mostly reduced to nervous wrecks. The last test was the most devious. 2 people, standing on platforms facing each other. We were told to vote for one person to win the ultimate prize, but the twist: if we both voted for the same person, the game would continue. But if we voted for each other, the first person to make it to the finish line would get the money. And the loser would be eliminated. Greg and I stood on opposite platforms, staring at each other. I couldn't believe this was happening. This was just like Squid Game, a game where alliances were formed and broken in an instant, where betrayal was the only way to win. I didn't trust Greg anymore. I wasn't sure if I ever had. The moment the timer started, I made my move. I voted for him. But Greg had made the same choice. In an instant, we were locked in a deadly race to reach the finish line, each of us willing to sacrifice the other for a chance at victory. As I sprinted toward the finish, I heard a gunshot in the distance, followed by a scream. It wasn't just Greg's voice, it was everyone's. The game was rigged, and we were all just pieces on a chessboard. When I crossed the finish line, I realized the true horror of the game. I had won, but I had lost everything. Greg was gone, the others were gone. The smiley face, the symbol of death and betrayal, stared at me from the walls. I was the only one left, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. The job seemed simple. So simple, in fact, that I almost didn't think twice when Pierre laid out the plan. He had a reputation. He was the guy you called when you wanted something stolen, but not just any heist. He was a professional, and this was his biggest score yet. The target? A facility in rural Quebec, where the rarest maple syrup in the world was stored. The syrup wasn't just expensive, it was nearly priceless, aged for decades, and only harvested from a specific breed of maple trees. Pierre had caught wind of the location, and had already done the groundwork. The job wasn't a standard robbery. This was something bigger. I was in deep with my finances. Maxed out credit cards, overdue bills, student loans piled up like an unscalable mountain. When Pierre offered me a cut of the loot, it was enough to clear my debts for good, and then some. I'd be set for life. The crew he assembled was small. Jason, the muscle, ex-military with a temper, was the type of guy who could handle anything physically. Sarah, the planner, knew logistics like nobody else. She could read a map better than most people could read a book. And me, well, I was the tech guy, the hacker. I was the one who could get us inside without triggering alarms. We made our way to Quebec, the plan laid out meticulously. The reserve was located in a remote part of the province, surrounded by dense forest, far from any prying eyes. No one was supposed to know what was inside the facility. It was a well-kept secret. Only those with the right connections knew that the syrup inside was worth more than gold. We arrived a few days early, scoping out the place. The high security wasn't a surprise, considering how valuable the syrup was. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and cameras covered every inch of the property. But Pierre had thought ahead. The surveillance footage looped every few hours, and I had already mapped out the blind spots. The vault was on the second floor, hidden behind thick steel doors, and there was a secondary entrance that wasn't monitored. We were going to get in, grab the barrels, and leave before anyone even realized what had happened. That night, we made our move. I hacked into the security system while Jason and Sarah set up the gear for extraction. There was no room for error. We couldn't afford to get caught, not with the stakes this high. The alarms were disabled, and the cameras went dark. We were in. The interior of the building was sterile, cold, and quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the security system and our footsteps on the concrete floors. We made our way to the vault, where the syrup barrels were supposed to be kept. When we got there, we saw it. The vault door was open, but the barrels were gone. For a moment, I thought I was seeing things. I double-checked the security feeds, but they were still showing the same thing. Empty shelves, and no sign of the syrup. The barrels, the very reason we were here, were just gone. Pierre's face went pale. "This is wrong," he muttered under his breath. "They're onto us. The game's changed." Before anyone could react, the lights flickered. Then the loudspeaker crackled to life, its sudden sharpness making us jump. "Welcome to the game." The voice wasn't familiar. It wasn't a security guard. It wasn't anyone we knew. "What the hell is this?" Jason muttered. The lights went out entirely, and the sounds of footsteps echoed down the hallway. We weren't alone. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut. We were trapped. The men who appeared in front of us wore black tactical gear, face masks, and gloves, completely anonymous. There were 6 of them, each carrying what looked like military-grade weapons. Their eyes were cold, and there was no sign of emotion on their faces. "We have a problem," one of them said, stepping forward. "You've just signed up for a game, and in this game, there are only 2 options. You win, or you lose." None of us said anything. We stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. The man continued, "The rules are simple. You'll each face a challenge. Fail, and you're out. The last one standing wins." The idea of a game felt surreal. It didn't make sense. This wasn't part of the plan, but it didn't matter. We were already in it. The first challenge came swiftly. The room where we were held suddenly transformed into an obstacle course, like a twisted version of a military training ground. We were told to run from one end to the other, without being caught. The only catch? There were guards stationed at various points in the course, armed and ready to stop anyone who moved too slowly. If they caught you, you were eliminated. The buzzer sounded, and we were off. Jason, always the strongest, sprinted ahead, his military training kicking in as he weaved between obstacles. Sarah and I kept pace behind him, trying to avoid the guards' lines of sight. But the place was a maze, and the closer we got to the extraction point, the more the pressure built. It felt like something out of a nightmare. One by one, people were caught. Sarah barely made it to the end, but Jason was already there, waiting for us. The next challenge wasn't as physical, but it was no less dangerous. We were given a series of puzzles to solve, each one more complicated than the last. Solve it quickly, and you advance. Fail, and you were removed. The room we were in was small, and the walls felt like they were closing in. Sweat dripped down my face as I tried to make sense of the numbers and symbols on the screen. I glanced over at Sarah. She was still calm, cool under pressure, but I could tell she was cracking. We were all cracking. But Jason was different. I knew something was off with him. The longer the game went on, the more desperate he became. That was when I realized the real game wasn't just the challenges. It was the people you were playing with. Like in Squid Game, the threats weren't just external, they were internal too. Every person here was a competitor, and in a game like this, you had to make alliances to survive. But you also had to be willing to betray those alliances when it came down to it. I had to choose, Sarah or Jason. If I wanted to survive, I had to pick a side. As the final challenge neared, the tension became unbearable. We were told that only one person could leave with the prize, a briefcase filled with cash, the ultimate reward. The rest would be left behind. The last game was a simple choice. A vote. We had to decide who would leave and who would stay. Jason looked at me, his expression cold. He was willing to do anything to survive. Sarah looked at me too, but there was a sadness in her eyes. She knew what I was about to do. I voted for Jason. He'd been playing me the entire time and I couldn't afford to be soft. Sarah was shocked, but she made the same choice. The guards didn't hesitate. They pulled Jason away. I was the last one standing. They handed me the briefcase. I had won. But the victory felt hollow. The syrup had been a lie. The game was never about the prize. It was about seeing who would crack, who would betray, who would survive. I left the facility a changed man. I had the money, yes, but the cost? It was more than I could bear. Like the players in Squid Game, I had survived, but I had lost everything that made me human. And now, all I could think about was the next game. If you've experienced a terrifying event or have a horror story to tell, we at AG Horrors want to hear from you. Share your experiences with us on Reddit, and let's uncover the mysteries hiding in the shadows together. And if you want to support the channel and help us bring even more terrifying content, consider checking out our support options on Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support means the world to us. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories like this one. And now, stay tuned for the next horror episode.